A friend once asked you, I guess, if you ever enjoyed life, and you replied, "Do I ever enjoy anything?" You talk about like anxiety.
Yeah.
Describe how that would come out in you.
As a kid, I would, I was 3 sports, I was the captain, I was straight A's, I was doing all this fun, cool stuff. I was loving it. I didn't feel pressured. I didn't feel like my parents were over my back or anything. I was just flourishing. But I never wanted to go on trips. They'd go, "Hey, we're going to skiing in Vermont." I'm like, "Oh, no, I don't want to do that." And I never really thought much about it until my parents would try to go away from town when I was a kid, and then I'd freak out and try to convince my other brothers and sisters that our babysitter's an axe murderer.
And you did once.
I did. Then I wanted to go to college, and when I finally decided to go to BYU on scholarship, I remember going to school, actually leaving the house and going on the plane. I dreaded it in a way that was like, I didn't know how to describe it to anybody. I didn't want to show it, but I was freaking out. And I barely made it through my first semester of college. Other kids, my brothers and sisters, "Yeah, let's go to school, it's sweet." Not me. I was like, "Hey," and that is what is separation anxiety. Kids have it, and that's what I had. It was genetic because of my mom's side of the family, but I did not know it until I was 33 years old under real duress when I was playing for the 49ers. It's another interesting but long story. But
Jim, your buddy, said about you at the time that you wouldn't do much, stayed in your dorm room, walked around with your head down, wouldn't engage socially, and seemed sad and sullen.
that first semester, I dreamed of going home. I didn't unpack my bags. That was the truth. Those guys became my best friends, and I'm grateful for them to walk it through with me, because they didn't know what is that? Why is it so hard? Why, my dad, just have fun. And the transition, the change, that's why it's called separation anxiety. It's to separate from home. And then once I went back for home for Christmas that first year, I realized when I got home, I couldn't wait to get home. I got home and like, oh, I have another home. My brain somehow kind of transitioned. I was like, and so then it was fine. Going to college was great. And that helped me make other transitions in my life. But childhood separation anxiety, in your genes, you're born with it. It influenced my life in a lot of ways that I didn't even realize.
And your mom, I think, was called the class mom for...
Yeah, in second grade, because I wouldn't go to school. Because I think the anxiety of something new, as a kid at 6, 7 years old, your body just says, don't do that, don't go. And so my mom would walk me to school, and then she would stick around for a little while I kind of got settled. And then I remember the teacher making me, we'll make you the president of the class. And that was like, somehow there's this other part of me that liked the achievement. Right? I was like, oh, okay, I'm good. But it's like, I think that's why I'm really big on mental health, because I want people to be able to ask questions, to be able to say, look, I have an insecurity. If you think you don't have insecurities, you're not human. And be able to be open and be vulnerable enough to say, I've been carrying and dragging this insecurity around I didn't even understand it. And if you don't realize how good life can be if we deal with it, if we can kind of name it. That was what was great when I was 33 years old, when the child psychologist, I ran up there because Jim Clint, the team doctor, finally said, look, bro, I think you got something going on from your childhood. And I ran up there and he's like, you have undiagnosed childhood separation anxiety. A lot of kids had it. It's in your genes. Naming it, and then I could be like, oh, that's why, on Saturdays before the games, I don't want to watch football. I want to watch, some movie, because I don't want to be reminded. The anxiety level for me was always higher. And I was like, why? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, because it's in your genes. And that helped.
In what ways will the anxiety come out in you today, and how have you learned to manage it?
The truth is, what was great about it was to talk about it, to know it, to point it out and say, that's a part of you that you didn't choose to take on. It's a part of your genes, and just like, and then dealing with it was like really powerful to be able to say it.
Well, and interestingly, you were talking about mental health before that was even really part of the conversation.
Right. During the day when I was growing up, I was the king. And then at night, I'm like, I gotta run home, I wrote a little children's book right when we won the Super Bowl. Then it was kind of this a lot of the stories of my growing up and paper routes and bikes and stuff and they go, what do you want to title it? And I go, I want to title it, At Least I'm Not As Weird as Steve Young. Because I think that's super powerful to be able to tell everybody, at least I'm not as weird. Because I think there's something as you're growing up, to feel like I can be vulnerable and it's okay, because like people are weird and that's cool. And how do we work it out? And so again, I retired mostly because I was worn out emotionally. Had been 18 years and I was just worn out. And I think that even more than physically. And in that way, the day I retired, I remember Brent Jones, my long-term roommate, my best friend, he goes, because he'd retired a couple years before, he goes, you're gonna love it. It's amazing. And it was amazing to leave it behind. And it felt like what I left behind was this sense of anxiety. And I couldn't get my heart rate above 30, like ever since. I think it got burned out somehow. But it's funny, if you just said that, because every time my wife says, we should move, there is a little feelings like, oh no, I like home. I think there's still in your genes a little bit of that.
You mentioned Joe Montana a bit ago. You had wrote in your book, which was fantastic, the pressure to replace Montana was unbearable. The weight of the expectations was crushing me. My anxiety was overwhelming me. You told your brother in one conversation you didn't think you were going to actually make it till Thanksgiving.
Christmas.
Yeah, right.
And
what did you mean by that?
You got to give me a minute here. Replacing Joe, trying to be Joe, what I realized very quickly is that if you're a fan of the 49ers, when Joe's not in the field, their only memory is Joe never threw an incompletion, never threw an interception, and never lost a game. And here comes this guy, which all he does is throw incompletions, throw interceptions, and lose games. So it's like this, it's all overwrought anyway. It's insanity. And I'm in the middle of the season. The Gulf War had broken out in the Middle East in October of 1991. And the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, it was the Gulf War, it's Steve Young's fault. Because it was funny, right? It's funny. But for me, living this out, I felt like I was in the bottom of a hole in depression and victimization. And everything's my fault. And on my way home, that's when I ran into the great Steve Covey, who said, I told him all the terrible things that were happening in my life. And he said, Steve, let me ask you a couple questions. Eddie DeBartolo, and I told him how great he was. Bill Walsh, I told him how great he was. And Joe Montana's on the team. I'm like, yeah, that's the problem. He goes, but if you had to ask him questions for mentorship, could you do it? I'm like, yeah, I could. He goes, Steve, I travel the world looking for platforms for human beings to have the ability to iterate and get better and find out how good they can get. And I can tell you, in traveling the world, I've never seen a better one, the one that you have. And I realized then, at that moment, literally at that moment, it became crystal clear to me that the hole that I was in the bottom of, I dug. The victimization that I felt was self-inflicted. And I had just lacked the perception and the perspective to see the opportunity. And I raced from that plane flight home and never looked back.